I want to start this talk with a story. In 2011, I interviewed a man named Gus. Gus was 75, and he's lived in the Washington, D.C. neighborhood of Anacostia pretty much his whole life. Anacostia is literally across the tracks. It's the neighborhood across the river from the rest of D.C. And over the years, it's gotten some kind of reputation. Like many inner-city black neighborhoods in the post-civil rights era, white flight and affluent black flight has left the neighborhood in disarray. But like many neighborhoods, for the people who live here, it is very firmly home. In addition, Anacostia is an important part of Black DC. It was founded originally by freed slaves, and in the late 1800s, one of the most famous former freed slaves, the abolitionist and politician Frederick Douglass, lived here. This is his house, Cedar Hill, which is a National Historic Site on W Street Southeast. Now, I'm a sociolinguist, so I'm interested not only in language, but also social context. And this is Gus's social context. The city's interested in this neighborhood. New people are starting to move in, new buildings are being built. And Gus had this to say about it. They're making vast improvements over there. They didn't make improvements for us. There's a bunch of stuff happening here. There's what he said and the attitude that he expresses, but also how he chooses to say it. You might listen to this and think, I hear something different. He's doing a bunch of things here. He's switching aren't to ain't, making to make, for to faux. And he doesn't do any of that in the sentence he says right before this. So it's not like he can't. He just isn't. Why? Well, what we see in Gus's talk is an example of what linguists call African American English. It's the grammatically patterned variety of English that's spoken by many, but not all, and not exclusively, African Americans in the United States. It is the most studied non-standardized variety of English, and linguists even call it spoken soul because of its special connection to the Black community. And it's at the root of this project. Geographers have called gentrification the production of space for increasingly affluent clientele. And linguists have studied it, but mostly from the perspective of landscape. Like, why is this store called Indique? Or why is this Starbucks labeled in Chinese? Gentrification, though, means that when that affluent clientele gets moved in, other people, well, they get moved out. And this is usually just as much a pattern of race as it is of class. So I got curious about whether language associated with race has anything to tell us about gentrification. Over a period of 10 years, I interviewed 34 African American residents of Anacostia. They ranged in age from 18 up to 90 something that my participant wouldn't tell me. And they had a lot to say. I looked at over 80 hours of data. And I looked at what they were talking about. The topic of each intonation unit, which is sort of how we organize our speech, where we pause and take a breath. So if someone was talking about their dog and then their cat, I might organize that into pets and then organize that entirely up into something like personal history. By coding this way, I ended up with a total of 10 topics. And then I looked at each intonation unit to see if it had any features of the grammar of African American English. I looked for things like ain't and didn't nobody and he run instead of he runs. And then I used the amount of AAE per unit to come up with a rate that I could compare across topics. We already know that people use stigmatized varieties differently based on audience and interview context, and that things like social class and gender and age affect the rate also. And it turns out, so does topic. Topic was a statistically significant factor in the rate of use of African American language. More of it got used in certain topics than in others. And what were those topics? Well, race and language and DC, and drumroll please, gentrification. Now, I want you to notice that race patterns along with these other geographic kind of topics. Other scholars have found that AAE is used more when talking about race and racial identity, which makes perfect sense for a variety that's associated with a racial identity, right? But why is it turning up here? Well, developers love to say that gentrification is really just about improving the city, like putting in a fancy new streetcar to take people places that the subway doesn't go. And they argue it's not about race, it's just about property, just about money. But with that in mind, let's revisit Gus. Remember that the first thing that Gus points out is they're making vast improvements. But then we get this huge grammatical change. Not they aren't making improvements, but they make improvements for us. This shift to African American English allows Gus to bring his racial identity to bear on his opposition to gentrification. The language becomes a linguistic way to mark his blackness and to assert his claim on this historically black neighborhood. So when these Anacastians talk about change and gentrification, they speak their race in order to talk about their place. African American English lets them assert that we're black, we're here, and this is our space. Thank you.